Education at Abbott. Please welcome to the stage Chris McGlone.
Thank you, Brad. Good afternoon. Experiences are the most impactful way to educate. And experiencing is the most impactful way to learn. And our job as educators is to identify exactly where our learners are on the learning curve and help them to progress. This is no surprise to any of you. We've been doing this ever since we were kids, going through experiences. Our parents, when they taught us to tie our shoes or ride a bike, they didn't give us an in-service. At least I hope they didn't. They gave us an experience. They put those shoelaces in our hands. They got us on the bike with the training wheels, pushed us down the street. And we learned by experience. And doctors are no different. The rate of innovation and new technology within healthcare is staggering. And doctors constantly have to understand what the new technology is, the newest techniques, and make sure they are up to speed. And those experiences are critical. In fact, the education is just as important as the technology itself. And my company, Abbott, has been providing that technology and that training for the last 130 years across the entire span of life. Everything from closing little holes in tiny preemie babies' hearts, to that Binax Now COVID test that maybe you took before you got on the plane, to the zone bars that you eat when you don't have time for lunch, all the way to the pacemakers that help regulate our heart rhythms. And I work with stents. Stents are little metal mesh tubes that go in your arteries that keep them open. And the rate of innovation and rate of change for a doctor to keep up with all of the new ideas, new approaches is staggering. They have to constantly be training, constantly be keeping things fresh. And the training is critical. A doctor's hands are just as important as the devices that he's using. We are at a unique moment in time. When I started in healthcare nearly 20 years ago as a mechanical engineer, and a doctor wanted to learn something new, he would have to go back to his textbook, or he'd have to wait till the next month for a new journal publication to come out, or the next quarter for the new guidelines. And can you imagine actually reading a book for information? It's mind-blowing, right? It doesn't even make sense anymore. But that's how they had to keep up. We're at a unique moment in time now because, as you all know, we have XR. And we can create these experiences and help them keep up. I've been involved in the training of thousands of doctors, and they are always looking for a new experience, a new way to stay fresh. And they'll look anywhere. I had one doctor who I was asking him about this and kind of looked around. He leaned in and he said, right before the procedure, sometimes I go to YouTube. So they're desperate for these experiences, and that's where we come in. And the data show that they work. An NIH-funded study at UCLA, published in the Journal of Surgical Education, trained med students on a surgical bone nailing procedure. And it compared traditional learning cohort to a VR cohort. And the VR cohort that you can see on the right was 3 times better in procedure planning, twice as good on instrument handling, 50% better on efficiency of motion, with half as many incorrect steps. Our friend on the left here who got the traditional training, you can see he's constantly referring back to his notes to make sure to go to the next step. Whereas the gentleman on the right in the VR cohort, rarely referring to the notes, because all he was doing was simply remembering the first time he did it in VR. He was going back to the human memories of that virtual experience. So back in 2018, my team and I looked at this and we said, cool, let's do it. And so we decided to put together a high-end, high-value VR experience. I mentioned I work with stents, and there was a new technology to allow you to look inside the artery for better stent placement. Usually it's X-ray from the outside, but you look inside and you can see and have optimal placement and make sure everything goes great for that patient. So we created this very high-end, high-tech VR experience. You could be in the cath lab, you could see how other doctors were doing it. You also actually went into a virtual cath lab where you could control the software, make the clinical decisions while you're interfacing with a real joystick in real world. So it was a ton of fun. It was great. We got a lot of accolades. The doctors were saying, this is great, super interactive. This is the best VR I've ever seen. There was a lot of high-fiving going on. But there was only one problem. We had invited the wrong doctors. We launched this at a trade show. And we stood on the edge and invited anyone who was walking down the aisles to come in and experience this very advanced, very detailed experience. And there was just a total mismatch with what that, you could say, random doctor walking down the aisle was looking for and what we were trying to offer. It might be akin to an experience maybe you've had. You go to Starbucks early in the morning, you're super tired, and you trudge up to the front, and this incredibly perky barista starts asking you questions about how's your day, what's going on, where are you going today, where are you traveling to, explains the Arabica beans, and you're thinking like, I just want a coffee. Like, I'm here for a different experience than what you're offering me. I think that's what these doctors had. We were offering them this, and they just wanted that. The reason is this: we all learn on a curve. We learn in stages. The first stage is awareness. What is it? Just expose me to this thing. What is it? Let me get comfortable with just seeing it for the first time. Then from awareness, we go to exploration. Okay? Let me wrestle with this idea. Let me figure out if I want to fit this into my life, into my workflow. Let me figure out if it's actually worth changing everything I'm currently doing in order to adopt this new way. And if it is, I cross that decision point and I move into competency. Okay, I've chosen. Now, let's walk through the steps. Let me learn what the workflow is. Let me learn the process. And then after some time of competency, I move to mastery. How can I maximize this? How can I get the most out of this experience? This may not be a shock to you, but if you're randomly grabbing people at a trade show, they're in the awareness phase. You can write that down if you want. So we had this total mismatch. After this, we had our epiphany, and we redeployed the same experience out to 11 hospitals in the US that were already using this inside the artery imaging technology. They had already adopted it, and they wanted to work through competency and get to mastery. And it was great. The very first hospital we went to, the very first physician, had a great experience. Later that week, on a Friday, he went into the lab, and he used his insights with a patient and helped them. And he was so thrilled with the results that he tweeted it. Yes, the doctors are on Twitter too. He was so thrilled because we had matched the right experience to where he was on the learning curve. This is the key point that I'm hoping to share today with all of you, that oftentimes when we think about XR, we think about it like this, with a tech-focused approach. Should I use VR? Should I use MR? Should I use AR? What's the difference? And then some vendor approaches us and says, hey, check this out. We're like, that is really cool. Let's use it. Where should we put it? And then we build it up, and the pilot is great, and the pilot was great, and that's it. Let me propose that we flip the paradigm, and we take a learner-centric approach. I mentioned at the beginning that experiences are the most impactful way to educate. Let's define impact as helping to move a learner from where they are on the learning curve to the next phase, or wherever they want to be. And at each stage in the learning curve, we need something different. Earlier on, we need something that's more passive, a simpler exposure, and gradually it gets into a more active type situation where now I'm engaged. In awareness, often what we need is simply something visual. Let me just see it. Just show me what it looks like. I don't need something totally immersive, just show me. If I'm at awareness, this is exactly what I need to help potentially move into exploration. Incidentally, visual experiences are much less expensive, much easier to roll out than all the other types. Okay, if I want to move through exploration, a social experience is ideal. Because this is where we ask questions, we wrestle with the idea, we dialogue with others. What do you think? Are you having the same concerns I am? Wait, I have a roadblock, help me through that. Then we get to the decision point. As you probably know, usually decisions are not something based purely on logic. There's oftentimes an emotional underpinning to when we make a big decision. And so emotional experiences are great for this part of the learning curve. Helping the learner to feel something, to cross that line into competency. Now that we're in competency, that's where we can bring in the mental experience. Show me the workflow, show me the process, help me think through it. I've chosen to adopt it, now I want to know the steps. And then finally, mastery, and this is especially true in healthcare, where doctors' hands are just as critical as the devices. A physical experience. Once we've laid it out like this, the XR solutions practically fall onto the page. In the awareness phase, if we need something visual, a 360 video will suffice. Maybe a simple AR web stream, a visualization. Social experiences might be virtual forums or avatar-based conversations. An emotional experience would be a state-dependent VR simulation, something to help me feel a particular way. A mental experience might be a remote proctoring or a holographic work instruction. And then once we get physical, that's where they become more haptic, intense simulations, tutorials, even physical simulators crossing over into the real world. I share this with you because it's been helpful for us in healthcare, but it's the human learning curve. It applies across all industries. And so in order to maybe help paint the picture a little more, I'd like to share a few examples so you can see how this might be applied and figure out if and how you'd like to translate this into your own space. So here's a question. How do we introduce doctors to the newest techniques? Usually doctors will use X-ray to look at the heart tissue or heart valves to determine if there's an issue and diagnose a problem. And recently, there was a new technology that came out that allowed you to use ultrasound instead of X-ray. You could get higher resolution to look at the heart, and you did not have to bombard the patient with dangerous radiation. My colleagues in our electrophysiology business unit decided that they wanted to help expose some physicians to this new idea. Not necessarily get them to adopt or anything like that, just expose them to the idea. Help them with exploration, and they chose a social experience. They created a virtual expert forum. They invited 21 physicians from 6 countries in Europe to come and just talk, to share, to ask questions of each other, to hear from thought leaders, see some basic information, dialogue, and start to work through that exploration phase. And the feedback was great. They gave it a 93 out of 100 in terms of the overall score of the experience. And there was one doctor in particular from Granada, Spain, who had such a good experience, he decided to go on to do advanced training, get the hands-on training, and he said it's completely changed his practice. He's able to see things in his patients' hearts that he wasn't seeing before. He's able to diagnose better and more accurately. And it started with this social experience because he was just there at that awareness and exploration phase. It was perfectly matched to what the learner's need was. How about this example? It's not just for doctors, it's for everyone. Let's talk about normal people like you and me. How do we help people who are afraid of donating blood? There's a global crisis in the blood supply. Average age of donation right now is 55. And millennials and Gen Z are not donating at the same rate that prior generations were. And because 60% of the world's blood supply is tested for safety in Abbott machines, we decided to set a sustainability goal of creating a sustainable global blood supply by the year 2030. And so we partnered up with some blood centers, surveyed 8,000 individuals in the US, and asked them, why are you not comfortable donating blood? And 2 reasons came to the top. The first was lack of familiarity with the process, what it's like, what it takes. And the second one was fear of needles. Needle phobia. Now, donating blood is a binary decision. Each of us could answer the question for ourselves. Either we did or did not donate blood this year. It's binary. So my colleagues in our diagnostics business wanted to help people with that decision point, moving from just exploration over to competency. So they chose an emotional experience. They created a state-dependent mixed reality simulation. So that while the individual is in the chair with the sleeve rolled up, arm immobile, donating blood, a peaceful, friendly orb named Willow hands them a satchel full of seeds, and using just their eyes, seeds to pick one out, and start planting the seeds in their mixed reality environment. And so while they're growing this garden, while they're giving life to their environment, they're simultaneously giving life to someone else. In the early test subjects, 91% said that they felt calm or relaxed during this experience. And this is so new that it's just launching right now. It's just being piloted in a couple of blood centers in the US, and hopefully will be rolled out broadly. But because we wanted to help someone move from exploration to competency, we chose an emotional experience. Let me give one more example just to paint the picture a little more clearly. How do we help doctors optimize patient procedures? I mentioned earlier that inside the artery imaging technology that we use for placing stents, and we had that very advanced mastery program, we decided to scale that a little more. We wanted to make it not just for the masters, but for those who wanted to gain competency. And so we created a mental experience, something to help the individual think through and work through that process. Someone who had already crossed the line of making that decision and wanted to grow in competency. So we created a multimodal VR curriculum. It had some basic teaching videos to get you the basic information, moved then into a 360 video lab environment where the doctor was talking to you, explaining their workflow, and it finally finished up with some assessments. If any of you here are educators or teachers, you know, if you ain't testing, you ain't teaching. So we finished with that assessment, and we went back and compared the results to the results of our traditional training. And participants who went through this were 50% more excited, 50% more engaged, and had 70% better knowledge retention. One doctor went through this experience in a US lab, literally took off the goggles, walked a few feet over next door into the lab, and used the information on a patient with what he called, quote, optimal results. So that day, one patient was helped, and since then, many hundreds more, because we chose a mental experience for working through competency. Experiences are the most impactful way to educate. Impact is defined as identifying where the learner is on the learning curve and helping them to progress to where they need to be. And at each stage in the learning curve, each of us needs something different. And this can help inform what type of XR solution we use. So my company, Abbott, touches the lives of 1 billion people every year. And I personally have been able, through this work, to touch the lives of many physicians and their patients. And that brings me meaning. And my intention here today, my sincere hope, is that each of you will be able to take these insights, bring them back to your own respective spheres, and in your own fields to positively impact human lives. Thanks for your time today.
Chris, that was excellent.